Anarcho-Capitalism, or Ancap, as described on Wikipedia, is a political philosophy and economic theory that advocates the elimination of centralized states in favor of a system of private property enforced by private agencies, free markets, and the right libertarian interpretation of self-ownership, which extends the concept to include control of private property as part of the self. At its core, anarcho-capitalism is a society based entirely on voluntary interaction. There is no overarching centralized power dictating obligations or enforcing those obligations. It is a society based entirely around voluntary contractual agreements and private entities enforcing those contracts. Anarcho-capitalism is predicated on what's called the non-aggression principle, an idea that an individual can only be held to obligations an individual has voluntarily entered into. In this video, I am going to examine why there aren't any Ancap societies today or in history. Ancap is a novel system in comparison to our world today and the world we've known throughout history. Let's start at the how of Ancap before we get to the why of Ancap. I'm using David D. Friedman, an economist who advocates for anarcho-capitalism, as my main source on understanding the how and why of anarcho-capitalism. I'm going to give a quick overview, but if you'd like to get into a lot more detail about how the system is theorized to work, I recommend this video narrated by David D. Friedman, which goes over the functioning and defends against the main critiques of Ancap. But here is my quick overview, highlighting the governmental functions that would be run under the free market and Ancap. Everyone, more or less, would have the same rights they have right now if they live in a free country. There would be private courts and private rights enforcement agencies, also known as REAs. It is expected that almost everyone would contract an REA to protect their rights and prosecute violations of their rights. So in the case of murder, theft, breach of contract, what have you, would result in the REAs of the parties involved arbitrating the violation through a private court in which both REAs agree to and trust. This private court would pass down its judgment and the REAs would enforce the judgment. If the guilty party did not follow through on the judgment, the court and REAs would have deals in place to essentially sanction the guilty party, excluding them of their economic freedom. So they would either have to go into exile or submit to the judgment. If you are still confused, don't worry. Watch the video I cited earlier because I glossed over the economic analysis underpinning the entire system. For the most part, this is how the governmental functions as we recognize them today would operate in the Ancap society. The free market and private industries would operate in much the same way as they do today. A good way to understand how any of this could be possible is to use the international relations framework of today as an analogy. As there is no powerful, central, international authority, countries regularly go against decisions made at the UN and nothing happens, except maybe sanctions, and that's usually done on a country-to-country basis. Yet there is peace and trade. It's far from the perfect analogy, but it helps to illustrate there doesn't need to be centralized authority for prosperity. The Ancap framework is a paradigm shift from how we today understand societal organization. In today's world, everyone, regardless of where they are born under some kind of centralized state power. These centralized powers have the legal right to assign and enforce obligation upon those under its jurisdiction on an involuntary basis, ultimately through coercion. Ancaps believe this system to be immoral. Ancap is not just a moral philosophy, but also a practical one. All governments are monopolies. Government reserves the sole exercise of certain functions that are not subject to market forces or competition. This allows a government to exercise certain functions without having to outcompete other entities in the execution of those functions. In the cases where an individual has the option to choose a non-governmental good or service, such as private schools, they must still pay taxes to fund the public schools. Ancaps want the freedom to interact and transact with complete autonomy. Ancap is often equated to libertarianism, but they are both distinct. Libertarians believe the government should only exercise functions which the free market struggles to exercise effectively, such as military force. Ancaps would in principle likely agree with this outlook, but believe the nature of government is to grow. So any government, regardless of the restrictions placed on it, will over time remove those restrictions on itself and become the intrusive and violent entity that Ancaps perceive today. Anarcho-capitalism is a fascinating idea because it is so novel. It shares the same optimism that anarchism and communism have. In all three of these ideas, there are a lot of answers for why the system would be ideal compared to our current system. But there is a lack of empirical evidence to support these systems' operations. However, unlike anarchism and communism, which typically dictate that once either of these systems is in place, the behavior of those in the system will change. So you can ask, well, what if people did this, based on our understanding of people? And you will be answered with something along the lines of, people wouldn't want/need to do that. Anarcho-capitalism differs because it espouses that the behavior of individuals and the forces those individuals experience is immutable, and the system of anarcho-capitalism will at last allow these individuals to craft their behavior and interact with those forces in the way that best suits them as an individual. It takes what we already understand about capitalism, economics, and human behavior and removes the forces and systems that impede their functioning through threat of coercion. In short, anarcho-capitalism doesn't expect an evolution in human behavior. It expects to unencumber human behavior. In my belief, this is what makes anarcho-capitalism a far more realistic system than anarchism or communism, albeit still highly unlikely. It expects the diversity of human experience that we can observe today and expects the mostly rational economics that are in play today. Regularly, I see anarcho-capitalism critiqued at the small scale, attacking how the individuals and firms will operate to sustain a prosperous society. But more or less, the main flaws of the inner workings of anarcho-capitalism have been identified, and those flaws have been either explained away or rationalized as being a worthy trade-off to our current system. I have no reason to believe Ancap in a vacuum wouldn't work in the ways economists such as David D. Freeman have laid out. Truly, I can believe that the system would be sustainable and not instantly devolve into chaos. This conclusion begs the question, then why aren't there any Ancap societies? A 1,000,000-to-1 answer question. But I think there are two reasons for why we see zero anarcho-capitalist societies in existence today, and why I don't believe an anarcho-capitalist society will be sustainable in the long term. In arguing this, I don't plan on critiquing Ancap so much, but how hard and unrealistic it is for governments to not come about under the flaws I perceive. These flaws being defense against foreign actors and emergencies. For anarcho-capitalism to work, it needs to work in a world that is not entirely anarcho-capitalist. It's easy to imagine a world working under a homogeneous system because the system would easily translate from the small scale to the large scale. The proponents of anarchism and communism often lay the system out in a global homogeneous way and ignore how the system would react when bumping up against a different system. I think friction between said system and a differing system is the greatest oversight of these systems and anarcho-capitalism. In a world through which there is only peaceful means to resolve conflict, I think an Ancap system would work well. Unfortunately, we live in a world which the threat of violence is always powerful and present. David D. Freeman theorizes under Ancap that what would prevent more powerful actors from making aggressive actions towards less powerful actors is that the less powerful actor would be willing to invest more resources into defending their resources than the powerful actor would gain from taking said resources. It's difficult to discern if this logic would hold on the small scale, but it would assuredly not hold at the large scale. The idea that conflict is an expensive lose-lose situation is a key factor in the success of anarcho-capitalism. This is not meant to be a solely monetary deterrent, but also a quality of life one. The reason being that no one would want to live in a war zone, so people will go to great lengths to avoid letting where they live turn into a war zone. But this falls apart when the parties in conflict are not in close proximity or one party has the ability to avoid having their territory becoming the war zone. Essentially being able to outsource many of the negative externalities of violent conflict. A great example of this are the U.S. wars, where the U.S. is engaged in foreign wars that inflict little devastation within the U.S., reducing a large amount of the cost of engaging in war, allowing the U.S. to perpetuate a war with no discernible short-term or long-term gain. This is where the Ancap society bumping up against a non-friendly society with a government would be at a huge disadvantage. A government with its predictable tax revenue would be able to plan and maintain a military force where the Ancap military firms would not be able to. To avoid a conflict, an Ancap military would have to plan and maintain a military force comparable to the governmental military over the long term, which would require that the citizens of the Ancap society voluntarily contribute to the private militaries to defend their society. Ideally, the Ancap society would have several defense firms that would compete with each other to create a more efficient and effective force to defend their society. It's likely that the Ancap military firms would be more efficient and effective in a dollar-for-dollar sense, but the issue is the amount of dollars they would be able to bring in. Defense is a classic example of a public good, and it's not unlikely that many in the Ancap society would choose to not contribute their money to the Ancap military forces because either way, they would be able to enjoy the results of the defense services. This would create a dilemma where either the Ancap society could risk not fielding the comparable military force or impose a mandatory defense contribution, at which point the society has created a mandatory tax violating Ancap principles. Perhaps this perspective is uncharitable. The country of Costa Rica doesn't have a military force and they are prosperous. However, I think this comes with significant trade-offs and relies heavily on the U.S. willingness to defend them in the case of military conflict. And regardless, the threat of military force still carries a large amount of value in preventing foreign intervention, exemplified by the Chinese and Iranians continuing to develop their own nuclear weapons. Before discussing emergencies, it's important I lay out the context of markets that these emergencies would affect. A monopoly by a single firm or a single person that owns everything is simply a government by a different name. For an anarcho-capitalist system to remain in operation, a free market is necessary. Many argue that in an Ancap system, a single firm would form a monopoly in one industry and then parlay that dominance into other industries, until they have a monopoly on all or a majority of industries, and then would take the form of a government due to their dominance in the market. I don't think this is necessarily true. I don't think it's impossible, but highly unlikely, and I think most Ancaps would agree because the trade-offs a firm must accept when growing. The line of reasoning follows that as a firm grows, they begin to experience inefficiencies from an increasingly large hierarchy. This phenomenon is most apparent in conglomerates. As conglomerates diversify their offerings, they grow their surface area for competition, further increase the complexity of their firm's hierarchy, and allow for failings to more easily pass unnoticed. Governments as we know it are conglomerates with a wide range of offerings, and I think everyone watching this now can rattle off a list of government failings to adequately supply those offerings. But can robust markets be maintained without government? There are informal economies, but these are typically extremely small scale, highly specialized economies, or supplementary to the formal economy. The extremely small scale mostly take place in developing countries where the government lacks the resources to monitor these activities at the small scale. The highly specialized take place primarily in the form of illegal activity, such as the illegal drug trade. The supplementary to the formal economy takes place most often in centrally planned economies where workers would accept work for their job outside of formal planning. In reality, there is no evidence of robust markets existing outside of government jurisdiction. There is, however, strong evidence that the removal of government causes market collapse. This is best exemplified in the aftermath of the fall of the Western Roman Empire, giving rise to the medieval feudal system. The same type of system that many detractors of Ancap fear would result from Ancap implementation. This is perhaps not a fair comparison, but as I stated previously, there doesn't exist a real-world example of anarcho-capitalism, so we have to try our best to extrapolate. Perhaps the people in this time period didn't have the knowledge or wisdom that we have the luxury of having today, to prevent allowing themselves to transition from Roman citizens to feudal subjects, where rights were lost or at best greatly diminished. Perhaps a society with knowledge of Ancap would recognize the opportunity and create their ideal society. But I think this line of thinking dances a little too closely to the utopian behavioral evolution we would expect from anarchism or communism. But it does illustrate the willingness of individuals to allow the formation of government in times of emergency. Examples of market collapse are extremely rare, but they illustrate that people in times of crisis tend to accept a reduction of rights for an increase in safety and stability. Market collapses are rare events, however, market failures are not. Market failure is an event in which the distributions of goods and services become highly inefficient. Although market failure is far less devastating than market collapse by definition, the incentive and opportunity for government to grow is present, or in the Ancap case, the opportunity for government creation. Market failures by nature are transitory and can be addressed by the free market itself, and in an Ancap society, I concede that many of its citizens could allow for many market failures to come and pass, because they recognize the trade-offs and pitfalls. But I doubt many citizens could stomach a market failure in which large economic damage is done or personal safety is at a higher risk. COVID-19 is a great example of this, a scenario where a deadly virus incentivizes people to not engage in economic activities and kills people. The world's governments took the opportunity to enforce lockdowns and restrict many freedoms that, for the most part, were readily accepted. We live in a chaotic world, and during times of chaos, time and time again, the world's governments have grown in an attempt to tame the chaos. Perhaps the Ancaps could keep their irrational fears in check and allow cooler heads to prevail, but unfortunately the history of human experience is not on their side.